Hi there, Alaska photographer Jeff Schultz here, and today I plan to show you exactly my step-by-step methods of photographing the aurora with my equipment and the way I do it. And for that matter, it works for most all night sky photography that I do. First, I'll show you just some of the non-photo gear that I use that I think you'll benefit from. And then I'll get into the actual photo equipment I use, along with the preparations of that equipment before I even go out and shoot the aurora. And I have to say that 75% of a good aurora shoot actually happens before I go out into the field. Second, I'll show you a little bit about how I scout for potential aurora locations and also forecast to see when the aurora is going to be good. Next, I'll go over my actual methods that I use with my own equipment to get good aurora photos. And also, I'll tell you some tips about what to do afterwards that'll help you out. Now remember, the way I photograph the aurora and everything, and just like I teach in my photo workshops and tours, is that I go fast, go light, and go simple. That's my motto. And I especially like the photography master Jay Meisel's motto, which is the more equipment you have, the less pictures you take. So bear that in mind as you watch this video. So let's jump right in, and here's some of the non-photo equipment that I use. So first is the headlamp. And honestly, any headlamp that has the ability to go from white and then to red will do the trick. This one is less than $5. But what I also like in the ideal world is one that has a rheostat on it, where you can adjust the light, especially white light. It's really tough when you go from red light or no light to white light, and it's a real big burst. So it's nice to tone that down if you have that capability. And it also comes in handy if I want to paint with light during the long exposure, so I can increase or decrease the intensity of the light. Now, because of my experience during the Iditarod and photographing at super sub-zero temperatures, a lot of people ask me what they should wear when they're doing winter photography. And honestly, parkas and pants and layers, that all is a personal preference thing. But I can tell you two things that are really important to me. And the first one is my feet. I know if my feet are warm, then I'm warm. So I use these Cabela's Trans-Alaska boots. And the big deal about these is not only are they insulated all over, but the big deal for these boots is that they keep my feet a good 1.5 or 2 inches off of the ground. And that's super important. So no matter what boots you buy, be sure they keep you off the ground, because that insulates you from that cold coming up from the snow and ice. That's a big deal. I'm also asked about what gloves to use. And I use these soft gloves. They're made by a number of different manufacturers, Outdoor Research, these are Black Diamond, Mountain Hardwear makes them, Cabela's makes them, but they're made out of windstopper material. And windstopper material, to me, they're just that much warmer. And I've learned, even though these are a little bit thick, I've still learned to deal with my buttons and dials with the gloves on. You just have to learn to do that. It's just a necessity. And I highly suggest not buying the gloves online because you just don't know what size. So go to the store, try them on, make sure it's a snug fit, but not so snug that the cold creeps in quickly or your heat dissipates quickly. I also use chemical hand warmers in my pockets and put my hands in there when it's too cold to warm them up a little bit. But honestly, what I think warms me up the most is the adrenaline when I'm photographing an exciting, adventurous type of image. Okay, so now you understand the non-photo equipment that I use. Here is the camera equipment that I use. And really, the camera body is just a personal preference choice. I try to find one that has the least noise at high ISO. And currently, I'm using both a Canon 1DX Mark II, a Canon 5D Mark IV, a Canon R6 mirrorless, and a Canon R5 mirrorless. My main go-to lenses in the order that I prefer for the aurora is number 1, a Canon 16 to 35 millimeter f2.8. Second is a Sigma 14 millimeter 1.8 art lens. And third is my Canon 24 millimeter f1.4 lens. And I always take it with, but don't always use it, and that's a 24 to 70 millimeter lens if I want a longer focal length. And any sturdy tripod will do, but of course it's a lot better if it has a ball head with a fast and easy to use quick release plate like this Really Right Stuff. so you can easily change cameras in the dark without needing to see anything. It should also be tall enough to not need to bend down. But as I teach in my photo tours, find your composition first before setting up your tripod. Oftentimes for the Aurora, my tripod is going to be low so that I can look up to the sky and have a good foreground. So I'm oftentimes shooting on my knees or sitting on my bottom, and sometimes even lying on my belly. So before you set up your tripod, find where you want your camera to be for good composition. Watch my video on how to select a tripod for real specific information. And the last piece of gear you really need is a shutter release. Some way to trip the shutter while not touching the camera. More specifics on types of shutter releases later. Okay, now we understand the equipment that I use. Now we want to know what are the basic camera settings that I use for my Aurora photography. And those basic camera settings are quite simple. For the file type, I use RAW. I'm always shooting in RAW, and it's best to shoot in RAW because there's more information. I change my histogram to RGB instead of an overall exposure so that I can see each individual channel of the color spectrum to make sure it's not being over or underexposed. The green and blue channels often get more individual exposure than the other red channel. Since more often than not I'm shooting in manual, the metering mode really doesn't matter. However, I have my metering pattern set to matrix or evaluative as a general rule, as I will switch from manual to aperture doing the Aurora photography. Color balance. Color balance is not a big deal if you're shooting in RAW because you can alter it easily in post. But my opinion is that it's best not to shoot in auto. Shoot in anything else but auto, because auto for me tends to change the balance throughout the night, and sometimes even picture to picture the light balance changes. So to make my processing easier, I stick to one white balance mode, and for me that is daylight. If you don't do it already, be sure to turn your highlight alert on. This is something I have on all the time, daytime or night photography, so that if anything is overexposed, it'll blink at me and tell me it's overexposed. Some cameras show zebras, but the last thing you want is to have an image of the actual Aurora be overexposed. So now I want to talk a little bit about how I literally set up my photography equipment before I go out, and suggest you do too for the night sky. And the very first thing to do is, if you use a UV filter or skylight filter, or some kind of protective filter, just take it off. For Aurora photography, it's really bad to have this on because you might get something like Newton rings, because the Aurora reflects off the front lens element into this and then back, and you have this problem. I highly recommend that you don't use skylight filters at all, period, ever. I never do use them. They get in the way. It's a $50 piece of glass in front of a couple $1,000 better piece of glass. In any case, I just don't even use them. Too much time wasted. But certainly do put on your lens hood. That's a big deal because frost will be falling throughout the night, and you want to be sure that your front lens element is taken care of there. Next, what you want to do is turn image stabilization off. Because you'll be on a tripod, it's best just to have image stabilization off, as it can cause blurry photos. And one thing you want to do with your cable release is to shorten it up. There's no reason to have a 2-foot long cable that you have to find dangling halfway on the ground. So I suggest you just tape it up so it's maybe a foot long, and it easily is findable just hanging right here next to the tripod. What I also do is I put some white gaffer tape on mine so that I can see it at dark, because I don't want to have my headlamp on. Now, one thing I highly recommend is to use a tethered release like this. I can't tell you how many times I have my clients out trying to figure out what's wrong with their Bluetooth one or their radio remote control one. Either they forgot the batteries are dead, it's not pairing, there's some problem, they're wasting valuable time. This is a bulletproof method to use. Use a tethered release. Well, I typically don't switch lenses a lot when shooting the Aurora. I do on occasion do it. So with this in mind, I use white gaffer tape like this and put it at the lens mount locations. White is a lot easier to see than the red, which the lens has, and makes it easier to put on and off in the dark. Having said that, again, I don't change lenses often. What I actually do is have two different bodies with two different lenses on two different tripods. Sometimes they're even both going at the same time, but sometimes I just switch one from the other. And I do that frequently. More often than not, I'll have the 16-35 on one and the 14mm lens on another. And again, those are full frame bodies. Sometimes even have a third camera on a tripod available. Usually that will be my 24 f1.4 lens. And then next, be sure you adjust your LCD brightness to its lowest setting. I do this for two reasons. One, it's because it'll preserve your night vision. I try not to use any white light at all when shooting. And then second is because we as humans look at the image on the LCD, and if it's too bright, we think we're overexposing it, when we know in reality we should be looking only at the histogram. See how the image on the left looks overexposed? That's because the LCD is really bright, and the image on the right looks normal. That's because the LCD is set to its lowest setting. Note, this is the same exact photograph. You can see because the exposures are exactly the same. So do not rely on what the image looks like, but rather specifically and completely your histogram only. Only use the image on the LCD to judge your composition, to look at focus, and especially to see if your horizon's straight or not. Also, again, if you don't use it already, I highly recommend using back button focus. Because when you use back button focus, you no longer need to manually switch your lens from autofocus to manual focus when shooting night photography. If your autofocus is enabled on the shutter release, when shooting night sky photography, your lens won't be able to focus. It'll just look for focus and can't find it. And sometimes you won't even know why the camera won't take a picture. That's happened to me before. It's likely because it's trying to focus and can't find anything. Now, another thing that I use oftentimes, especially if I'm waiting for the Aurora for a long time, is just some sort of a plastic bag or something just to cover up my camera, because I just don't want all that frost coming down on it. So have a plastic bag to cover up your camera. And also have a lens cloth available. So a good lens cloth, you want to constantly be looking at your lens, even with your headlamp on. Be sure your lens is clear of any frost. And finally, what you want to do is you really want to know how to use your camera in the dark. It's really important knowing just where the most used buttons are located. You just ideally don't want to have to use white or even red light to look for stuff. You want to be able to do it in the dark because other people might be shooting and you'll interrupt them. Next, I want to talk briefly about finding locations, composition, and forecasting the Aurora. I think everybody's going to have their own ideas on this, but I'll just let you know what I do. As far as finding locations, I, for one, really enjoy finding locations that have something of interest in the foreground, rather than just trees and sky. So to that end, I'll look for locations that look to the north-northeast where the Aurora typically first appears and also has something of significance and compositionally appealing, like open water before it freezes for reflections, or perhaps a cabin or a meadow lined with snow-covered trees. Just something unique and interesting. In the ideal world, I look for these places either days or weeks, even sometimes years, beforehand in order to scout the location in daylight and see what the options are. And ideally, because the Aurora is moving around, there would be open sky and as large an arc as possible without trees covering up. Ideally 360 degrees around so that when the Aurora moves, I can point the camera in another direction where it's at and still have something of value in the foreground. I mean, imagine this. These images were all shot in one night in the Ruth Amphitheater, where I had a 360-degree view all around me. It was fabulous to get so many different compositions one night. Now, as far as composition of the Aurora, no matter how you compose, be sure you double check your horizons are straight. It's very easy at night to not make it so. I've made this mistake often and still do. Just like my daytime landscapes, I typically try to find something in the foreground that has a leading line that moves a person into the frame and some type of borders that force the eye to move around and around. Because the Aurora is constantly moving and changing shape, it's not always easy to compose so that the arcs and swirls move a person's eye through the frame. but it's still something I attempt to do on the fly as I'm shooting. Sometimes it's just as simple as swinging the camera left or right. Now, when you're thinking about composition, also keep in mind that likely you want everything in focus. In other words, lots of depth of field. Here is a chart that is basically the depth of field you get when you're focused at infinity, because you do have depth of field in front of that infinity focus. I think this information is totally invaluable. It allows me to get most all of my foreground sharp as well as the aurora. All I need to do is look at this chart and find my lens focal length and the aperture I'm using. Then look at the near distance it is calculated, and then just step back that appropriate distance from the nearest foreground subject. And then everything from infinity back to this near distance spot will be in focus. Besides this chart, you can use the hyperfocal table on the PhotoPills app in order to figure this out for other lenses or aperture. So what's next? Well, forecasting the aurora. Ideally, we would know when they're going to come out exactly, but that's just not something that's possible. And I got to tell you, I am not a good forecaster. So I suggest Googling how to forecast the northern lights to find an app you like. So I rely on those apps as well as word of mouth from friends that are better at it than I am. Personally, I typically look at the University of Alaska Geophysical Institute forecast and also NOAA space weather conditions. Finally, now is the time I'm going to show you my step-by-step method, exactly how I set up my cameras to do aurora photography and night sky photography. Honestly, it's not rocket science. You probably do a lot of this already yourself. But the very first thing we have to do is get an in-focus picture. Focusing at night is sometimes not so easy, so follow these steps that I found as my best practice. Trust me, I've done this more than once, and there's nothing worse than shooting the aurora for a few hours, only to find out when I get the photos home that they're not tack sharp. Everything is out of focus. So as for focusing, remember two things are an absolute. One, if you're using a zoom lens and you change the focal length of the lens at any time, meaning you zoom in or out, you must refocus before shooting again. This stands to reason whether it's night, sky, or daylight. And number two, always be sure infinity is in focus, meaning the stars and the moon and the aurora. Even if you're trying to get something in focus in the foreground, it's more important to get the aurora and stars sharp. So always focus at infinity. So how do you get the aurora in focus at night? Well, here's a list of 5 methods that will guarantee that you get infinity in focus, which is what you want. No matter which of the 5 methods you plan to use, first set your lens to the focal length you want for the image. But that said, if you choose to change your focal length for a better composition on the night of photography, remember you need to refocus using one of these 5 methods. My #1 focus method that has worked for me for many years is to autofocus on the moon. That is, of course, if the moon is visible in any phase 1/4 to full while you're shooting. Check your moon app to see if it will be visible during your time out. If the moon is out, turn on your autofocus and select the very center focus point to be active. This is usually the most accurate. Point that center focus square on the moon and press your focus button. Then what I do is manually throw it way out of focus, and I push the focus button again so that I can see the moon actually come into sharp focus. If you don't use back button focus, then I will also switch the lens on to manual focus right after autofocus. Otherwise, when triggering the shutter with the cable release, it will activate focus and not be able to focus on a black sky. To make sure that I do not move something, if I happen to move the camera around, I typically will tape the focus ring down using gaffer tape after I focus. The second best method I use is when the moon is not out. Then I will focus on some far distance light source, using the same exact method as I focused on the moon. With any lens that is 24mm or wider, as long as this light you're focusing on is 50 feet or more away, it will be plenty far away to focus as if it was infinity. You can use any light source such as a street lamp or porch light, distant city lights, your car headlights, etc. If you are in a completely dark place with no lights around, then what I do is I take my headlamp with the white light on and I walk at least 50 feet away from the camera, place it on the ground facing me, go back to the camera, and focus on it the same way as if it was the moon. Basically, turn on your autofocus and point the center active focus square on the light and press your focus button. Again, I manually throw the lens way out of focus and push the focus button again so that I can see the light actually come into focus. And again, you do need to switch the autofocus off on your lens if you don't use back button focus. Remember, do not zoom in when you're doing this. My third best option is if I see on my app that the moon is not going to be out when I expect to shoot, then I will go before dark and turn on my autofocus and put the center active focus square on the mountains or something extremely far away in daylight. Then, again, make sure that I do not move something. If I happen to move the camera around, I will tape the focus ring down. And again, if you don't use back button focus, then you'll also turn the lens to manual focus. The big bummer about this method is that your cameras are useless pretty much for anything other than night sky photography because you don't want to change focus. The fourth best method I use is to use live view. Many people like this. I don't care for it as much as the others. To do this, first switch your lens to manual focus, then manually focus the lens to the infinity mark. Look through the viewfinder and find the brightest star and put it in the very center of your frame. Turn on live view and adjust the exposure so that you can see the little white dot of a star. And then zoom in on the live view to the maximum. Do not zoom in using your lens. Then manually rack the focus slowly back and forth and stop when it is at the sharpest. Again, best is to throw it way out of focus and then slowly bring it into focus until that star is sharp. It certainly helps to use something like a hoodman loop to enlarge it even more. Best then again to tape the focus ring down so it doesn't move. If you use this method and you're not using back button focus, you'll still need to switch your lens to manual focus. The fifth and final method that I use is to use the infinity scale on your lens if you trust it. You really need to know that your lens is absolutely accurate with this infinity scale. When the focus mark is in the middle of the mark, test it first. I find most lenses will focus either before or after the actual infinity mark, depending on the temperature and focal length. I only have one lens that is actually sharp when using this infinity scale, and even then I don't want to trust it. I prefer to use my other methods. Finally, no matter which of the 5 methods that you use, be sure you always shoot a test shot image and check the focus on your screen by zooming in and/or using a loop before continuing to shoot. This is so very important. As I mentioned earlier, nothing worse than photographing for a good length of time only to find out that the photos are out of focus. So always shoot a test image and check the focus on the screen using a hoodman loop or something similar. So next is proper exposure. So getting proper exposure of the Aurora is the same as anything else using the exposure triangle. Your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed are a combination of all that. And let's just back up just a minute and just remember, the only way to know if you are properly exposing any photograph, whether it's daylight or night sky photography, is by using the histogram. The only way is using the histogram. As I've taught before, if you're shooting daylight photographs, you want your histogram to be to the right side as much as possible without overexposing or clipping the highlights that should have detail. There is more information on the right side of the histogram. Now, for night sky photography, that's not quite the same. It's not the same because there's oftentimes much less, quote, medium gray, unquote, subject than there is black, dark sky. So, in most all night sky photography, a properly exposed histogram is going to be much further to the left, or the underexposed part, but also have a reasonable amount in the middle area. Like this example. This is a good exposure of night sky photography with the Aurora. Just as in daylight photography though, it's still a matter of looking to see what the light value is in the elements of your scene. This will then dictate how much of your histogram is to the very left, dark, or in the middle area. Obviously, if you have an image like this with a lot of aurora, then it's going to be more in the middle because the aurora is more of a medium tone versus an image like this that has a lot of dark sky and just a little bit of aurora. Then naturally, there's going to be more of your histogram to the left in the dark area. The histogram will also change based on how much of the foreground is in the picture and just how lit up it is. I mean, for instance, on a full moon night, if you have a lot of foreground lit up, your histogram will show that there's a lot more to the right and middle like this. No matter what with aurora, to be properly exposed, you don't want a histogram to be this far to the left, though, in the dark area. That is just plain underexposed. This is another reason why, as I mentioned earlier, you want to turn your LCD to its darkest level. Because as a human being, you and I are going to want to look at the photo itself rather than the histogram. And if it's too bright, we're going to freak out. And by freaking out, I mean likely change our exposure so that it's darker. This is also another reason to turn on highlight alert, so that you know for sure that you are not overexposing the aurora either. So figuring out my aurora exposure is the same as I do for any other image. What is my end game? That's what I teach my photo tour clients. What's the end game? Do I need to stop the action, so I need a fast shutter speed? Do I need a lot of depth of field? What is it exactly? So with my aurora photos, I argue there's 4 things that I want with my aurora photos as my end game. And those are, I want the stars to be sharp. It just looks more natural. That's number 1. Number 2, right along with that, I want to stop the aurora as best I can to show those ribbons and curtains that I can see with my eye, rather than a moving, blurry blob. Therefore, the settings I use work to get the shortest shutter speed I can get to stop the aurora movement. And my third part of the end game is I also want an image that is not super noisy and full of grain so that I can't even enlarge it up to a wall-size image. Therefore, I use a camera body that has a sensor that I know won't be overly noisy at a higher ISO, like 2000 to 5000, somewhere in that area. And number 4, if I can, I want to get all the foreground elements in the frame as sharp and in focus as possible. Therefore, I will position myself far enough away from the closest object to keep it in focus at a wide open aperture. So with all of this in mind, I typically use manual exposure most of the time. There are times, as I'll explain in a minute, where manual is not so good. And manual definitely requires you to take regular heat of the histogram and be sure your exposure is accurate. When using manual, I choose the widest aperture of the lens I have, f1.4, f2.8, whatever is the fastest aperture of the lens I'm using. In doing so, that will already help me out to get the fastest shutter speed and the lowest ISO combination. Next, using the Spot Stars calculator in the PhotoPills app, I will look at the combination of the focal length and the widest aperture of the lens I'm using and determine what the maximum exposure time I can use in order to get sharp stars. Sometimes I may fudge this by 1 or 3 seconds and make a longer exposure if I need to. Now, special note, for those of you who are unaware, back in the film days, we used to use the 500 rule to get sharp stars, where you divide 500 by the focal length of the lens you're using. That figures what we used to know how many seconds long we could expose the image before you notice star movement. So you know that 500 formula just doesn't work anymore. With the advances of digital imaging, with much better clarity of our lenses and sensors, and we're blowing pictures up a lot bigger, we can see movement in the stars much earlier than we could before. So now there's a new rule. It's called the NPF rule, where N stands for aperture, P stands for pixel, and F is focal length. It's a hairy calculation, but it's much better. As you can see here, the NPF formula, suffice it to say, it takes an awful lot of math using information that we don't have at our fingertips. It's more than one can do in their head, like the 500 rule. So trust me when I say find an app like PhotoPills that you can use for this complex equation. If you want to know more, just do a Google search for NPF stars rule. There's a number of great articles out there. Now, back to proper exposure. So with my 4 points of the end game in mind, sharp stars, stopping the aurora, less noise and lots of depth of field, I'm pretty much locked into the fastest aperture of my lens, 2.8 in the case of this 16 to 35 millimeter Canon lens, as well as the time indicated with the NPF rules for sharp stars, about 9 seconds. So the only other option of the exposure triangle left to use, of course, is the ISO. So I simply dial in the ISO that works according to my histogram. So I'll typically start out at ISO 2000 and see where I need to go from there for proper exposure. If the histogram is too far to the left, underexposed, I increase my ISO upward to 4000 or perhaps more. And conversely, if the histogram is too far to the right, overexposed, I bring my ISO down to perhaps 1000 or less. And I work at all this based solely on the histogram. And I'm either changing either the shutter speed or ISO or both to match the current circumstances until I have a good histogram. You know, the aurora changes in intensity as well as speed and brightness quickly and often. So it's important to consult your histogram often and make appropriate adjustments as the light changes. This is especially true if you're shooting in manual exposure. Do not overexpose the aurora. You can't get overexposure back. So those are the steps I take in manual mode to make proper exposure. Of course, we all know that Mother Nature throws things at us, and we'll obviously have to change and adapt on the fly, which I do often, and so will you. I typically don't change my aperture. It's typically just the shutter speed and the ISO. I keep my aperture wide open. But speaking of aperture, there are times when I don't use manual exposure and I'll use aperture value or aperture priority. So more often than not, I use aperture value when I'm doing time-lapse photos of the aurora, which is when I typically let the camera just keep firing for a very long period of time, like 15 or 30 minutes, and when I'm typically not near the camera, or when I set up a camera and just let it shoot on its own while I'm busy with 1 or 2 other cameras. Oftentimes that's in a different location. Or when the aurora is changing brightness rapidly. So when shooting the aurora in aperture value, my end game is the same: sharp stars, sharp aurora, and less noise. Though, if I'm doing a time lapse, having sharp stars are not as important because they will blend together and move in the video anyway. So you can get away with a longer exposure. I'll typically use the same settings I just figured out in manual exposure to start me off in aperture priority. My aperture is wide open. The ISO is whatever I thought most recently with the manual exposure. But now, in aperture value or aperture priority, I set the exposure compensation to +1 stop. That will overexpose the image just slightly, and because it's a dark photo to begin with, it typically works out well. So the shutter speed is whatever the camera figures it is. And I just keep my camera release switched on, and it continues to take photos one right after the other. Of course, another option with time-lapse photography is to use an app and calculate how many exposures you want for a certain length of time. It's a little bit harder to do with Aurora because those exposures can be longer. But in any case, that's deeper than this video is going to go. So you can Google time-lapse Aurora photography and hear somebody else talk about it. But here's a big note. If you're using aperture value and your eye is away from the viewfinder, you need to put something dark over the viewfinder to cover it up. Otherwise, light will leak into the camera and will cause a different exposure, typically a darker exposure. So now that you have an in-focus picture and it's properly exposed, I would suggest trying some experimentation. Do a different composition rather than the same thing over and over. Here's an image of mine shot when the aurora was pretty faint, but using a 30-minute exposure. Look what I got, something different. So if you can handle the complexity and have the option, using 2 cameras or even 3 is a real good option. This allows me to not only get different compositions, but also different focal lengths. Now, one thing you want to do is keep your cameras outside the entire time you plan to take pictures. Just change the battery if it gets cold and doesn't work. Your camera does not need to be warm in order to work, only the battery. Once your camera's been outside a long time and gets cold soaked, do not take it inside without protection, and I'll explain that in a minute. Now, be sure you check your lens for frost regularly and have your lens cloth handy. Have a spare battery warm in your pocket ready to go. So now you're done photographing. The aurora's done, or else you're just too tired to stay awake, or whatever the situation is, maybe too cold. In any case, it's time to go back. What you don't want to do is just pack up your camera, take it inside to a warm place. I learned this lesson many times on the Iditarod. Put your camera into a plastic bag first, because if you don't, it's going to frost up and condensate, sometimes even inside the lens, and that's the worst. It can be really harmful to your camera and especially your lens, especially if the condensation happens between the elements. Don't let it happen to you. It happened to me. Watch and listen to me explain what I do before I go back indoors. So the first thing I do is I want to take the battery out of the camera and I want to take the card out of the camera. And I just put them into a safe place so that I can bring them indoors. They don't need to be in a plastic bag or anything. I just take the two of those and put them somewhere safe. Next though, I take the camera itself and I put it into a plastic bag. And the plastic bag doesn't really matter. You can use a bag from the grocery store, you can use a plastic bag from the garbage, or what I like to use is I use some sort of a dry bag that I can use over and over, and they're also tougher. In any case, I take the entire camera with the lens. If you have a big enough bag, you can put 2 cameras in here, and I just put the whole thing inside like this. And then the big deal, of course, is to not open the camera up until it's had time to warm up inside. So as long as your plastic bag does not let any air in, which is what this doesn't do. So this plastic bag, or in this case a dry bag, I just take it inside just like this, and I let it warm up as long as necessary. It could be a couple hours, but on a day like this where it's 2 degrees outside, it's going to take 4 or 5 hours. If I want to warm it up faster, just put it up high, like on Iditarod. I put this thing up right next to a wood stove up real high where it's super warm, and it just warms up that much quicker. So what happens if you take it inside, it's all wrapped up, you take it inside and you go, oh no, I need to take a photograph because something's happening outside. Well, don't open it up inside. Take the whole camera in the bag outdoors where it's cold, open it up and take the camera out, and it'll be just fine. Obviously put the battery back in a card and you're set to go. So there you have it. Don't let photographing the aurora intimidate you. It's just like anything else with low level light. It's either a longer shutter speed or a wider aperture or a higher ISO, a combination thereof, and a sturdy tripod, of course. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please click the thumbs up, like it, and please subscribe to my channel, and I'd be grateful if you shared this with your friends. Thanks so much for playing, and happy shooting. Bye-bye.